Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to have you all with us today. We are here for an amazing event called Empowering Voices, Unveiling Insights from the Other Black Voter. And my name is Mary Beth Gassman. I'm a professor at Rutgers University, and I also have the pleasure of being the executive director of the Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice and the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. We are sponsoring this great work. We love to sponsor initiatives by our visiting scholars, and Amanda Wilkerson is one of our visiting scholars and brought this work to us. So we're thrilled to have her with us and an amazing team. So I am going to go into the background and hand it over to Eugene Pringle, who is going to moderate this amazing session. And I hope we have some great discussion. Just keep in mind, put your questions in the Q&A. And I'm sure this team will take questions after the initial presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Hey everyone, just wanted to say welcome. Excited to be here for what I think is going to be a good day of learning, but more importantly, some information that is much necessary, especially given some of the political climate that we're in today. So we're going to start off with some brief introductions, if that's okay. So I am Eugene Pringle. I will be moderating today. I currently serve as a senior professorial lecturer in the School of Education at American University in the Education Policy and Leadership program. So I'm going to pass it to Dr. Wilkerson.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Wilkerson. I'm really thrilled to be here today and honestly excited that many of you have joined today. And for those who will be viewing this after this live recording, hello to you all. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida and the lead researcher for this work regarding the political socialization of Black youth voters.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shalonda Samuels. I go by Shelly. I'm an assistant professor at Kane University in New Jersey, and my focus is on literacy. As an Afro-Caribbean scholar, my focus is always to make sure that, I include K-12 teachers because that is my background, and to ensure that our English language learners are always supported. Thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have this conversation.
Good afternoon. I am Allison Clark, and I am the principal scientist of Black and Blue Research, which is a boutique research agency that I founded based on the diaspora of Black people, us being treated as a monolith in messaging, and me being a practitioner in civic engagement. I found that the messaging was lacking for people who identify as Black and African American. And yes, there is a difference.
All right, nice. So we're going to go ahead and get started again. Looking forward to this conversation today. So do we want to start with the PowerPoint presentation? So Amanda is going to give us an overview of this research again, which is so pivotal. And then after that, we will move into a panel discussion in which we will talk about this research, the advocacy, the implications of it from everyone on the panel. And then at the end, we'll leave some time for Q&A from our participants. So I'm going to pass it over to Amanda.
Thank you, Eugene. Just waiting for the PowerPoint to come up, but I want to say that you all are not here by accident today. What I really want us to do is think about the idea of the other Black voter. And my intent is to share with you how we came to that title, what inspired this research, and to also really show you how collectively we worked on recommendations that we hope first students might be able to use. Obviously, those who are working with students, particularly those at HBCUs, might utilize the information in this report, but also thinking about how this report is so robust that it goes further than academia. And so I really hope that as you are participating in this conversation, that we engage you in a way that inspires you to think about this work in your own area and how you can use it, and also to think about questions that you might have for us. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So about 2 years ago, I received funding from the National Science Foundation to be able to do some critical work where I'd have an opportunity to look at the political socialization of Black voters, particularly those who are educated at HBCUs. And I thought it was very important to do this work. And over this summer, this last summer, 2023, sent out a lot of articles. Some of them got accepted, and I noticed that there wasn't any impact. meaning no one was picking up the work. No one was really talking about what happened with what we found. And yet we uncovered some deeply rich narratives about the experiences of our participants. And then I reread the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, where he really talks about the other America. In this speech, he gives a critique of the injustices that happens in the America that we know and the America that we don't know. And in fact, it got me thinking about the other Black voter. I'll put it to you this way. When you hear the word American voter, what comes to mind? If it's not a Black voter, then what comes to mind when you hear the word Black voters? And if it's not a youth voter, what comes to mind when you think about Black youth voters? And here's the crux of how we pursued this new work in terms of thinking about how we would share our findings with a more broader audience. We wanted to introduce the other Black voter. So we can go ahead to the next slide. I will tell you that I came to this work initially, all of the researchers involved in this work, and Dr. Rebecca Interest, who isn't here today, but at the time was my graduate assistant. We really wanted to come and discuss what was already out there about Black youth voters versus what we found. And to be honest with you, what we learned is that when you look at literature on Black youth voters, there's an assumption that they're not engaged politically, that they're not voting. And yet, when we talked to our voters, we got more of an expanded view, our participants, I should say. We got more of an expanded view of who they were because they're deeply engaged and connected to social and political issues, but these issues matter to them. The other thing that I felt was prevalent in the literature that we read, and we previewed a lot of literature. We read The American Voter, which is really a cornerstone piece about the experiences of voters in this country. And one of the things that were mentioned about Black youth voters in particular is that they are single issue voters, that they only care about one issue. And what we found is very different. Our participants exposed us to ideas where they shared information about how they were interested in a multitude of issues. And then finally, when people think about voters, but in particular Black youth voters, they think that they are a homogenous voting bloc. And what we found is that they are a combination of voters who have different experiences, and those experiences lead them to have a variety of different ways of enacting on their beliefs and values. So, what I would like to do is give you a better snapshot of who our participants were. We can move on to the next slide. So we did our study, and it was focused really on the state of Florida. In the state of Florida, $23 million during the last election cycle was spent on just messaging alone. And then we looked at reports from Pew Research where it indicated that those who are educated or have some form of a post-secondary education are more likely to vote. And so what we did was put together the idea of how can we reach educated voters for this study who are just beginning to vote that would be willing to share their experiences with us. So we focused on looking at Black students who attended HBCUs in the state of Florida, and they were between the ages of 18 to 29. We collected multiple forms of data. Participants were able to participate in a survey, a 50-question survey. And then after participating in the survey, they participated in small focus groups where we were able to pull more information from them about their experiences other than their thoughts and perceptions about where they stood in terms of the messaging that they received. And we really unearthed rich data and stories that we're going to share today. I'd like to give you a preview of some of those stories by looking at what we found in our next slide. So in speaking with these participants, one of the interesting things is they were really willing to tell us a lot. Initially, when we went in and talked to them, no one was really reticent about talking about their views and perceptions regarding messaging. In fact, they were waiting for us to come and discuss. And when I say us, they want to be heard. And I think it's very important that one of the things we end up talking about in the report is amplifying their voices. One thing that stood out to me is when one of the participants said to us, what are their motivations for voting? And without prompting, they started talking about the historicalness of voting amongst African Americans. They understood that people fought for the right to vote, and that some people even died for this right to vote. And they honor that. But what was more important to them is that the people who were asking for their vote were willing to do something with it. Another thing that we thought was interesting to highlight, and I'm going to make sense of this when we go to the next slide, is the lesson that we learned about how voters or our participants got involved or engaged politically. What we know about political engagement is voting. But what the literature says about political engagement is that someone can be involved in volunteering, working on a campaign, taking up a particular issue. And our voters really, our participants really talked about how when they aren't interested in the candidate, they're less likely to vote, but it doesn't change their ability to want to be interested in political activity. And then finally, what I thought was a very interesting takeaway, and I want to bring you back to a point that I mentioned earlier about the amount of money that was spent on messaging just in the state of Florida. More than millions, multiple millions was spent all across the 50 states here when it comes to messaging. But the fact that they don't like social media ads coming to them, political ads coming to them, which is interesting because they're digital natives. They haven't lived in a society where they haven't had a cell phone, access to the internet, or don't engage with other people online. So all of these different highlighted quotes help me to understand a little bit more about who we were talking to in terms of Black youth voters. Next slide, please. Essentially, the history of the research information that we read about youth Black voters initially, where they would highlight the stories of John Lewis, showed us that those Black voters, youth voters, were fighters. They were fighting for the right to vote, particularly for those who didn't have access to the right to vote, and they lived during a time where they were able to see the transition from 1964 and 65, where they were able to vote. And then the next generation of Black voters enjoyed the privilege of voting, where they understood the stories about people fighting for the right to vote, fighting for folks to be registered, understanding that even though we had the right to vote, there were still forms of regressive tactics used to suppress the vote. And then this generation feels that they have the prerogative to vote. Now, what we wanted to do is really make sure that we didn't critique their perspective. I wanted to make sure that we understood what this meant. And in short, what we argue is that Black youth voters have evolved, and yet organizing tactics and messaging tactics have not. So where does this leave us all? And again, I'm just providing the context for you so that as we're sharing questions about what we found, you can localize it within the context of what I'm sharing right now. Next slide. Essentially, we believe that number one, work like this hasn't been highlighted before. Let me give you an example. What we normally read and hear about voters generally is turnout, not about socialization. Socialization refers to the development of their beliefs and their values and attitudes, and how those beliefs, values, and attitudes then are turned into ways where they are engaged. And so we need to amplify their voices, hear more stories, really ask different questions about these participants so that we are moving away from just understanding voter turnout and understanding what is really motivating people to be engaged politically so that they can vote. The other thing that I think that we need to have a renewed vision on is understanding how to adjust the messaging. If I can give you an example, get out the vote and voting are very critical, cornerstone messaging points when it comes to any voting demographic. But what happens when that voting demographic has never had to deal with the complexities of fighting for their vote? telling someone to go and vote after they have earned the right and fought for the right to vote is very powerful. But it's very different when they've had the prerogative, for example, to vote, or the privilege. And so we do need to adjust the messaging so it is in line with the experiences of the people that we're trying to leverage that messaging with. And then finally, we have to interrogate systems that don't allow for voters to evolve. I frankly feel that it's significant for us to be able to share this information about what we found. But I think the most impactful thing, going back to impact and why I was dissatisfied with research material being put out, but not merely making an impact, is that we need to look at systems, and instead of saying, you voters aren't voting, what are systems doing to entree them in to exercising these rights to vote and taking it to where they are? And so I hope, if you haven't gotten an opportunity just yet, that after hearing this little bit and more from the co-authors, some of the co-authors of the report, that you will indulge in reading the report and seeing how you can leverage information from the report that will be in line with amplifying youth voters and thinking about that other youth voter. We can go to the next slide, but really, I think we are primed for starting our conversation. So I'm ready for a Q&A.
All right, thank you, Amanda. So that just pumped me up. As I said earlier, I think that we are at a crossroads in a different way than we've seen before in this country, specifically as it relates to voting and how we use our voice for voting. So many issues are happening right now in this country and abroad. And so at the cornerstone of this particular work is this notion of political socialization. And so one of the questions that I'll pose specifically to Amanda, but to anyone, is when we talk about political socialization of HBCU students, like, what does that mean and why is that important in the context of this research?
So I'm gonna tell you why it's important within the context of HBCU students. Number one, I think that there's been interesting conversation that's happened nationally about the type of students and the type of leaders that are produced out of HBCUs. While Kamala Harris might have not been a secret to Howard University, while Stacey Abrams may have not been a secret to Spelman College, while Andrew Gillum, as a Floridian, I could say this, may not have been a secret to Florida A&M University, and countless others who serve in a variety of different capacities where they end up being vanguards and leaders for their community, particularly political leaders, to the world, to the rest of the world. They were absolute strangers. And yet, when we go onto HBCU campuses, in terms of just not even involved with doing this research, in terms of just our experiences for those who have attended HBCUs and graduated from HBCUs, we know that HBCUs tend to be the stumping ground for developing students so they can be whatsoever they want to be. Right? They are primed to help students think about, yes, this is where you are at now, in the words of Mary McLeod Bethune, where you can enter to learn, right? But depart to serve. And so the reason why I wanted to look at socialization is so that I could elevate this conversation in a way where people understand that their values and beliefs really get developed while they're on college campuses. Now, let me be clear. I don't think that HBCUs bring in students to develop them to be political actors. But I do think that the environments at HBCUs allow students to believe that they can be leaders, that they can run for SGA, and that they can use their SGA experiences or leadership experiences to run and be in student government, excuse me, to be in national government. And the reason why this is very critical is because it goes back to answering the question about socialization. I'll put it this way, Converse, and I'll end it because I want us to get to a lot of questions. Converse and his associates created the manual, The American Voter. They said most of our socialization politically comes from our parents, but developmentally, that's where it starts. It's not where it ends. We pick up our values and beliefs based on our experiences, and think about the experiences that students are having, not just at HBCUs, but at campuses right now, all across the United States. If that is the case, that we're developing our values and beliefs regarding how we want to enter the political realm, then schools in general, but in particular HBCUs, because we have these hidden figures, these leaders tend to be very important. I'm just asking different questions. I want to know about your socialization, not about who you're supporting. I want to know about messaging, not about what party you're a part of.
Nice. So, Shelly, I want to go into two questions specific to you that I want to ask you. Amanda mentioned elevating the conversation. And one of the ways that you all elevated the conversation was through the research methodology. And so the question that I have for you, Shelly, is how did the research methodology contribute to the depth and accuracy of the findings? That's the first thing. And was there anything that surprised you?
Okay, all right. So as you heard from Amanda, you saw how important it was, and you see how passionate she gets when she talks about this research. The methodology that we utilized contributed to the depth and accuracy because it allowed for consistency and reliability, all right, in our results. We didn't want these results to be based on just our feelings and our own experiences alone. We wanted it to be precise in the work that we were doing because we understand how important it was. So we approached this two ways. We conducted a survey, and the survey was about 50 questions, so it was extensive to get just basic, I don't want to say basic, but just some surface information. But as we know with surveys, sometimes they can get tiring, especially if an individual is just doing 10 questions, 10, 15, 20 questions alone by themselves with no one to bounce ideas off of or to engage in dialogue. So in addition to the survey questions that were extremely important, EJ, we also employed focus groups. Now, focus groups allowed us to get into the real conversation, the nitty-gritty of it all. And as you heard Amanda talk or discuss about the participants and how passionate they were ready to share. All right, so during the focus groups, we were able to ask the participants about 10 questions about political socialization, relevant political issues, political advertisement, and so on. And just to think of the importance of cultural and relevant messaging. And each student had multiple opportunity to speak throughout the focus groups, which is the reason why we like focus groups so much. And the focus groups were about 60 minutes. That information was recorded and transcribed, of course. Ultimately, we did not want the work that we were doing to be contested in any way. So we followed every single protocol we needed to not only engage the students in conversation, but to make sure, we were crossing our T's and dotting our I's because we want, people to listen. We want to make sure that the work that we're sharing is relevant. It's most definitely relevant, especially in this year that we're in now, the election year, but that it's timely and that people would listen. We want this work to truly have impact. So we made sure that we took every precaution we could to make sure we were doing this appropriately. And the other question you mentioned was about things that were surprising. To be honest, I wasn't totally surprised by what these participants were saying. And I want to say students, but they're more than students. They're valuable citizens, right? So I don't want to just minimize them to just being students. I wasn't totally surprised because today's generation, they're extremely vocal, right, in their stances on causes that are significant to them. And so they wanted to share. They wanted to share and discuss their perspectives and talk about how policies are impacting them. They are cognizant of how these policies impact them. And if they're not in support of the leaders who are in charge, like Amanda mentioned, they still find other ways to get involved. So they may not necessarily vote for a particular person, but it doesn't mean they're not going out and showing action in other ways. So one of the findings that also was mentioned earlier was, talking about campaign messaging failures. I thought that was interesting, not surprising, but interesting because, the idea of a negative campaign advertisements tend to instill this heightened sense of uncertainty for our student participants, especially as it relates to who is sending the message. So you would think that the sender of these advertisements, these negative messaging advertisements, would have some kind of impact, but it actually is having the adverse effect on these students because the students are now thinking, well, if this is the way you're going about trying to out someone or trying to, show a negative light on this other party, what is there that we're going to learn about you? You know, what is in your closet that is going to eventually come out? And so there's some scrutiny there. So, you know, that was highlighted for me because, again, we think these individuals love social media. They love the hype. They love the mess, and they really don't. They want you to be legitimate in the way that you're coming, because they want to make sure that the ideas that you're sharing, you're intentional and you're considering this diverse population that you're sharing this information with.
Nice. I love that. One of the things that I appreciate about this report specifically is over time, we've seen in many social movements where voters, and specifically Black youth voters, and specifically Black youth voters at HBCUs, have been such a part of the movement. And what I appreciate about this, when we talk about political socialization of students at HBCUs present day, is going back to that word elevate. It elevates the conversation and forces us to think differently about how we actually do this in a time that is very pivotal, again, as those movements have been as well. So my next question is for Allison. In thinking about this report, it's mentioned that some of the research sheds light on the perspectives of Black youth voters. Could you share some of the key insights into those perspectives?
Absolutely. And I think both my colleagues had mentioned a couple of them already. The historical factor, which I want to flesh out a little more. It's more of, I'm dating myself, Janet Jackson, what have you done for me lately? Is the attitude. It's my generation has been considered the civil rights voter. It was enough that my forefathers fought, died, bled to vote. But this, as Amanda pointed out, we're at the prerogative stage of voting. And so what can you do to earn my vote? And that the other finding was no the political affiliation per se, neither a Democrat or a Republican. So once again, what are you going to do for me? And I want to highlight some of the research that, because it's an election year that is coming out now, some disaggregated data, and that's a problem in itself, using those methods to study people of color, Black people specifically, and even our Hispanic brothers and sisters, treating them as the same, an entire population, when they're not. So that is an issue. But one of the things that is coming out is, once young youth voters who voted in 2020 because of the urgency, they voted, but it's now, how are you going to get me back to the polls? Okay, I voted then, but again, what have you done for me lately? Research is showing once they have information, there's an aha moment. So there is hope along those lines. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, which this was a surprise to me, not too much because I do know some people, political activism, but don't vote. Not making that connection. And I lived in DC for a season. And I knew people who, my joke was, you go to protest and then you go to brunch. And so there were people who were in the streets protesting at that time, but didn't vote. And so being able to make that connection, organizations that do this work, who really do this work, realize you need to engage people 24/7, 365. You can't show up knocking on doors a week before the election where they've dropped $1 million in the state, $1 million to you to do something in a week when you needed that money 9 months ago. So those are some of the highlights of what they had to say that makes us think.
Speaking of dropping $1 million, we know that in order to do this type of work, large impact as you all are doing, you got to go where the money reside, right? So thinking about that and the way that this particular project was funded, I would like for you, Amanda, to talk to us a little bit about, one, what was that funding process like as far as NSF funding this research, but also how did it contribute to the overall scope and impact of the research project?
Okay, so NSF, the National Science Foundation, threw their weight behind this study. And for me, that was a big deal. because I was asking new questions about a population of people that really register as less than 13% of the overall population of voters in this country. Um, and knock, knock, hello. I'm not a political scientist. I got my degrees in political science, but my doctorate is in higher education administration. So, why am I saying this? I believe that this isn't just research, Pringle. It's a comprehensive dive into the political heartbeat of this country, utilizing the lens of Black youth voters, particularly those who are at historically Black colleges and universities. So I believe that NSF's financial support of this work allowed us to move beyond just skimming the surface, which honestly is kind of the norm when you start looking at research on Black political socialization. In fact, the last major piece of work that was written about political socialization that had to do with Black voters was in 1969. So by allowing us to fund this work, it gave all of us really an opportunity to dive deep with the surveys and figure out what questions we want to ask. What questions were already out there? What questions could we use from different organizations that had vetted these questions with other participants that we could utilize for our survey? And then really thinking about the focus groups. How would we engage the students? Being mindful about the age of the students. I know that Pew Research has come out with information about Black voters, and their crosstabs, it looks at 18 to 45-year-olds. We specifically look at 18 to 29-year-olds because we knew where to find them. And so the other thing was by having this financial support, it allowed us to do some serious analysis. Now, intersect that with the work that I'm able to do proudly with the center along with Mary Beth, well, really under her tutelage, where I'm learning from her because I've been a visiting scholar with the center for almost 6 years now. I was able to take the financial support that we have and work with Mary Beth so that we can really develop something to disseminate to public audiences. So it was about one, giving unheard voices an opportunity to be heard through financial support, and knowing that we were also given an opportunity to share that information more broadly by the work that visiting scholars are invited to do with the center.
All right, so I want to bounce back to Allison really quickly. You talked about some of the time that you spent in DC and some of the things that you saw. But as we know, in a lot of spaces, not just DC, there are a lot of people advocating for certain policy and things like that. So in thinking about this report, what implications do the report's findings have for policy and advocacy related to the Black youth voters and HBCU students?
You know, I gave this some thought. I'm going to speak to it as a PWI graduate and what I have observed, who has relatives who went to Bethune-Cookman and FAMU specifically, and know the stories. And so I feel I can objectively say to my HBCU alums, you do a better job at socialization than PWIs, period. I went looking for community and support, which is why I wound up pledging Delta Sigma Theta. And so I think that others can learn from HBCUs. It's a natural thing, as Amanda said, making those connections of justice and what is important to our community is a natural for other youth voters. Black youth voters include those who went to PWIs and who didn't go to college at all. And as I stated, you've got to keep them informed. You've got to keep them engaged throughout the year. Otherwise, you look transactional, and you are transactional, and they don't like that. Another thing that I think our HBCUs help us with is the cultural competency. Being able to help shape that messaging, knowing how to speak to that age group. You know, now I think we're at Gen X and now Alpha. So you can't speak to them like they're boomers. You just can't. And the authenticity, I think that Shelley lifted up, that is crucial. If you look on social media, it's like people have radar when you're not authentic, and they know it, and especially the young people. And let's be real, we're dealing with AI as a possible issue now. So just add that fuel to the fire. So I think with policy wise, our HBCUs in socialization are ahead. I mean, Amanda, you can give us a little more research on that, but I think HBCUs are ahead. And I say that as a PWI graduate.
Well, so this is the interesting thing. I love to look at systems and structures. So you have a system of higher education, and within that system, you have structures. So the structures would be like the individual institutions that support them. Let's think about what the system was created to do in terms of post-secondary education and who it was created to serve, right? And then let's look at the structures that are doing the work. And so I see, to your point about how HBCUs tend to be environmentally supportive of students, just like becoming and belonging, right? I see how they can do that because if you look at their history and why they were founded, it's in line with how the students respond and the outcome really of those students. And listen, in a perfect world, we want every student to graduate from college and do well in college. We want every graduate to be a superstar, like some of the ones that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and who are not political national figures. The reality is, it's not the case, but that does look different at PWIs because our initial pilot project was to look at Black students, and we didn't make a delineation between HSI, PWI, HBCU. But after looking at the Black students at PWIs, I was like, we got to start with HBCUs. Their why, their conviction, without even talking to them, I knew we were going to get a different story. So I do believe it has a lot to do with systems and structures. And to add in, you know, some of the stuff that Mary Beth likes to talk about, the history of an institution, how it's formed, and the origins of it, it really informs the practices that are there today and the culture that's in place today.
Nice. So one of the things we know about HBCUs is they are spaces of civic engagement, sometimes inherently in a lot of cases, right? Earlier, Amanda, when you were talking, one of the comments that you made was that this research as a body is like a comprehensive deep dive, which I appreciated because for me, that incites some type of action. Like it's not just what's on the paper, we have to incite some type of action. So Shelley, the question that I want to ask you next is thinking about that. When I hear deep dive, I think of engagement and more so civic engagement. So in thinking about this report, how can this report be used to encourage greater civic engagement and political participation among Black youth voters?
And that's a great question. I also am thinking, how could it not kind of encourage greater civic engagement, right? In order for us to really do that, though, we can't do what Allison just explained and say some people do, is just kind of wait until the last minute to try and grab as many people as they can, right? We have to begin investing in these students and in considering them as citizens, right? And they're investing in themselves, right? They're going out looking to seek knowledge, and so we have to have that information to share with them. So we have to be able to work with them as they're, invest in them rather, and share in how they can take part in political and civic engagement. For example, to encourage a greater civic engagement, we have to listen to what they're saying. They're telling us exactly how they want. It's like a teacher, and your student is saying, this doesn't work for me, right? So they're telling us this doesn't work. Here is something that works. So we have to kind of listen to them and give them our attention. It makes us actually also look at how we should be sharing this information everywhere. This report should not just be between us, the researchers that are doing the work. We should be sharing it everywhere we go, right? They should see us coming and they think, oh, here we go. We're about to get some more information. But that will allow people to be in the know, right? And I know that especially as scholars of color and Black scholars, we're often so cautious about the type of research that we are able to do, that we're willing to go out and do, and how we're disseminating this information, because we don't want to offend anyone, right? Because we understand that there are repercussions, in certain spaces. And so we've historically been, I guess we've had to overthink how we're going to do that. But I think we have to think about, if we're going to encourage civic, we have to think maybe the ways we've been going about it is no longer appropriate. So we have to think about what are some of the changes that we can make. As researchers, we may want to think of how to pivot, how and where are we doing this research? What is the focus of the research that we're doing? And how are we able to promote these opportunities for community participation? Another thing Amanda and I talked about earlier this week is we have to trust and respect how voters in our community want to take action for themselves. We can't go in thinking we know and imposing our own thoughts and our opinions on them. We have to listen to them and respect how they want to go about doing, what they feel they should do. And we have to be able to treat them like humans, humanize the interactions, and focus on the concerns that they have and the experiences that they have. Because what we found were these student participants had such rich data to share with us, data in form of their experiences, their thoughts, their ideas. So we have to prioritize understanding and demonstrating a willingness to be able to engage with them before just soliciting their involvement in political activities when they don't trust us. We have to be able to garner that trust and consider the inclusivity that there are. When we can't just say, for example, let's form a task force. What does that mean? Are these task force student-based? Are we considering how we're going to facilitate conversation and programming and the centers and the space that we're creating for them to actually do the work? So those things I think we have to consider when we're talking about long-term civic engagement, and not just, like Ellison mentioned, election year, or that season. For long-term is what we want this work to be, something that has a powerful effect, so that, next year and the year after, we're still working. And that's what we try to do with this work.
Nice. I like that. So, Amanda, one of the things that I'm thinking about is typically when people do this kind of work, we're coming from the lens of researcher, scholar practitioner, but thinking about real world application and how you all are pushing to support to actually impact change. It's kind of a two-part question. My first part of the question is, what recommendations, if any, does the offer for educational institutions, policymakers, and community organizations, and what barriers are there?
Okay. Yeah, so, okay, how do I want to say this? The report wasn't just about diagnosing a problem, nor is it only about prescribing, what we think educators, policymakers, those who are working with community organizations such as nonpartisan 501c4 organizations should do. I think, one, it was really about identifying that, one, we're talking about a block of participants that we haven't heard from before. Listen, you and I live in a society right now where when people think about Black youth voters, the images that are going to come to their mind is a John Lewis when he was protesting and wanting to get engaged and involved and wanting to fight for the right to vote so many years ago. And I respect what he did. That's critically important. But there's a new face to the same participant, And yet that paradigm hasn't shifted in terms of how we use this information as an instrument, this report as an instrument to amplify their voices and really engage, help us understand how to support their civic engagement. So I think a part of it is reimagining our socialization about civic engagement curriculum. Now, I'll pause right now. One of my biggest fears in having this conversation is that I'm an assistant professor in the state of Florida, and Florida is a very unique state right now. Hard pause, stop. I'll let y'all digest that and we'll move on, right? What do I mean by that? I really want to say that it's not about creating a curriculum to teach people how to vote. It's about looking at those who are training student personnel professionals and saying, when we're thinking about student development identity, yeah, we go to sexual identity, yeah, we go to race, yeah, we go to gender, but what happens when we talk about political socialization? And yet we have spaces on campus where students can protest. We invite different political speakers on campus. And what we generally do is push away from the table and be like, that's their positionality. I do think that we need to really reimagine how we prepare professionals who are working with students to think about how we support their civic engagement through the lens of socialization. The other thing, as it pertains to policymakers, is there needs to be a real call for them to understand the unique political landscape of voters, but in particular, Black youth voters. When politicians, for example, think about Black voters, they think about Black voters in a one dimensional manner. They're going to go to the church. Well, sorry to let you know, but I'm a bruncher. And now that COVID has come and gone, my invitation to church is through my laptop. Now, that's me, a 43-year-old educated African American woman. What about the 18 to 29-year-old college student who is now able to be engaged in the same manner because people want their vote? And you're going to the church and they're at, bougie and brunch breakfast. You see where I'm going with this? And so we really have to make a concerted effort to allow policymakers to understand in a unique way. They really know a lot about getting into our community, but who are you reaching when you come in? And then with community organizations, and this is where I think it's critical, especially when we start thinking about some of the recommendations that was shared in the report. They, for me, tend to be the bridge. There are going to be certain things that in education or in post-secondary education, I'm going to have limits to. I'm not going to be able to do. I am hired as a researcher with teaching responsibilities to train post-secondary professionals come out and do work that helps student success. And when we think about student success, it's about graduation, retention, so forth and so on. But I think this is important. And they may not be able to do everything, but community organizations can. Policymakers the same way. So how do we bridge these three groups together? I think it's very important to connect the dots by thinking about the day-to-day lives of students and consider the fact that we've offered what I believe to be a blueprint for action that practitioners can tailor so that they can make a difference. Now, that's what I think about the recommendations galore and how you leverage them. With regard to your question about tackling the barriers for young Black voters, I will tell you that I was very surprised to read in the Chronicle about a week ago, really, Chronicle of Higher Education, that more state legislators are moving to pass legislation that was stymied. Think about that. We're a democratized society. Why are we thinking about ways to indirectly stop people from being able to register to vote? But in particular, they have focused their attention on college voters. What does that mean? If you grew up in Florida and you wanted to go to school in New Jersey, right, at Rutgers University, that would mean that when you are living there for 9 months out of the year, you have access to participate civically by voting. But if the state makes it where it's very hard to transfer your vote or to register to vote in the area that you now live a majority of your time in, then you're left with voting absentee. And we know that that comes with a litany of opportunities, we'll say that, but also with some challenges. I'm thinking about Jermaine Dupree when he talked about some of the challenges his daughter faced in being able to do an absentee vote for Miss Abrams when she was running for office. So here's the thing that I think that we have to really focus on when it comes to barriers, that it's not just academic. It's about tearing down barriers that would, to go back to the point that I just shared with you all, that voters are facing. And we assume that Black voters will be facing these challenges too. We also have to really ensure that we're moving skepticism away from digital messaging to the real impact of messaging directly to people anywhere where they're receiving it. I'm gonna tell you that hurdle comes when you know voters and you meeting them where they're at. I wrote an article in the Heisinger report looking at Kamala Harris' approach with her voter tour that she was doing, because she was specifically going to colleges. And she's coming in as an uninvited guest with a great message, right? She's encouraging people to exercise their civic duty. The problem with that is that she's sitting in an auditorium in the middle of a stage, talking to people that may not necessarily be the folks that she is trying to talk to, because they're out on the quad. They're going to class. They may be eating. So if you're going to come to a college campus, can we at least go where the students are at? We got to start thinking about those barriers too, how we're approaching them. And so I really believe, and I'm trying to round this out, but I have so many thoughts when it comes to barriers, that there are ways to suggest more accessibility to ensure that voters are heard, seen, and valued. And I think it's about moving from the obstacles I talked about to thinking about the opportunities. And I really believe that the recommendations serve as an initial guide for thinking through those opportunities.
Nice. So the report is titled Analyzing the Political Socialization of Historically Black Colleges and University Students, Preliminary Findings. So I want each of you, just to round us out and to finish up, to take about 30 seconds to respond. So we'll start with Shelly, then we'll move to Allison, and then we'll finish with Amanda. So Shelly, I want to know, are there any future implications for communities as it relates to this report? Allison, I would like to know, are there any future implications for policy and advocacy? And then Amanda, I would like to know from you, are there any future implications for further research to continue to contextualize this particular topic? So we'll start with Shelly, we'll go to Allison, and then we'll finish with Amanda.
Well, what I'm going to do is, because Amanda and I talked about this earlier too, was talk about implications for potential research. And I believe one of our viewers asked also about future research or actions that can be taken after, creating the report and sharing. So I think one of the things we discuss is kind of making sure that this is more generalizable, right? So we need the information from HBCUs, but we also have to look outside of HBCUs, considering students that are not in HBCUs, but also would like to share, because they also would like to have a platform. They also have rich data and experience that they have to add to what we are saying to the public. I'm currently at an HSI, and I have many Black students who would love to engage in this dialogue, because this is relevant to them. And it also expands the research and giving us greater perspective as an MSI. So in my mind, I think many of our MSIs, of course, not all, but many of our MSIs have similar goals, right? For marginalized learners. And so we should give them the opportunity to speak. So I think that's something that we can look forward to in the future, is making this more generalizable outside of HBCUs once we've gotten, the information that we can use. And then secondly, a big thing in having this conversation too with Amanda, I was like, oh, this is me. We were talking about, we have to do a better job in disaggregating HBCU Black youth, because that's what we looked at, HBCU Black youth, when we considered our participants. But I can consider myself, for example, I'm a Black woman from the Caribbean, I'm Afro-Caribbean, and that is very, very important to me and my identity. It's also had impact on my ideologies, on political socializations, right? There aren't many places where my identity is clearly stated, and it's important. And so the students said that too. They were saying, you know, please, I'm Black, yes, but in addition to that, I'm Haitian, I'm from Jamaica. They wanted those things to be identified and not just be put under the umbrella of a Black student. So I think that's something that we have to do in the future to make sure that we're incorporating everyone. Did I answer that? Yes? Okay, I know we're running out of time.
Okay, so I think you asked about policy and advocacy. So one of the things is the ability to connect the dots. I think this report demonstrates that traditional methods are not working, and the ability to, I'll say three things: listen, learn, and pivot. Once you get that information, you don't have time to try to, just what you're hearing. And one other thing, I would say the relational organizing, which means that personal conversation, which I feel like we as a community have been doing for years, but this is the hot thing, relational organizing with an app. Basically, you're talking to people, having deep conversations. And when you get young people, and I'm sure the audience might be students, but if you are students, grab a boomer and talk to them and tell them what you're thinking along these lines. And if you're a boomer, grab a young person and listen to what they're saying. That's my advice.
So the report, Pringle, is just, it's just the starting point. I think that we have laid the groundwork, right, to really think about what's next, but now. And the reason why I say what's next, so look into the future, but thinking about it now, is because time is of essence. You have so many people who are having conversations about political engagement, um, and yet I think that their eyes would be open to understanding it in a different way if we provided them with this other contextualized information about a population of voters who we know. A lot about, but when it comes to their turnout, but very little when it comes to their socialization. So I do believe that this work opens the door to understanding political socialization, getting people to think about how we invoke this lens into additional research, right? Um, and then I also think as a whole world out there, more is waiting to be explored. Like, I think what derailed us the most, and derail may not be a good word, but what made me come to the table thinking I was going to get feedback that really we didn't get at all, was that we got illuminated about things that I hadn't thought about. The fact that just because somebody isn't voting doesn't mean they're not engaged. Now, we want people to vote personally, but as a researcher, I was hearing them differently, right? And I think we ought to explore the actions of this population of people very differently. What happens is we explore and critique instead of explore to understand. I think more studies, more in depth, more understanding. It's about keeping the momentum going, if you will. I was talking with a dear friend of mine, Dr. Dave Eddieburn, and he said to me, "Well, how do you ensure that this continues to be something that you will be able to work on, where you're bringing voices to the forefront about political discourse?" And I said, not waiting for an election year, even though I know that this is where most eyeballs will be placed on this kind of information, which is why I was really very grateful to have the guidance from Mary Beth to put together a report. Because what I initially showed her, I don't know if I should even say, she wholeheartedly debunked it. She was like, no, she wanted us to write something that was actionable. And it got me thinking about this work in a very different way. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in short, when talking about research endeavors, there's a lot of gaps to be filled. I think what we're doing now is just breaking new ground. And what we have to do is have a call to action about what will be the roadmap for engagement, what will be the roadmap for a critical conversation on the ways that higher education interplay with the political landscape of today. And to me, this isn't just about a research report or a research project. It's about developing a line of research that we can continue to do in the future. Imagine other people taking this work and saying, well, they looked at socialization and messaging of Black students on HBCU campuses. Could we think about the development of this? Can we think about this within terms of development of the student? Can we think about this in terms of student activities and the student? Can we think about this in professional development of those who work with it? There's so many different areas that could be explored based on what we found.
So awesome job. Very enlightening conversation. The one question that we did have from a participant was actually answered. And that question focused specifically on, how do we make this more actionable through the research and the results of this research? And that was a question from participant Sharika Dakers. So we are at time. So I want to thank you all specifically for this report and the work that you have done. Really creating something that is actionable, that can be used time after time after time, especially as we go into this voting season, but more importantly, outside of the voting season as well. So the materials for this particular webinar will be posted in about a week. They'll be sent out to all the participants. So we want to thank all the attendees that are here today with us. We also want to thank the Proctor Institute for Minority Serving Institutions at Rutgers for allowing us the opportunity to be here. And this recording will be sent out. So if that is all, thank you all. Have a great evening.